Chapter 4. Rough Justice. There is going to be some in-fight turbulence. That was the warning I gave to Theresa May once I found out my feat as Lord Chancellor and Justice Secretary in her cabinet. Theresa became Prime Minister after Cameron resigned following the referendum vote in favour for Brexit. She arrived with a mandate to get Brexit done, but I was preparing for a different fight. Taking on the British judiciary over their appointment practices, I had a premonition it would end in tears. My tears. But what's the point of being in government if you're not going to push for what you believe in? I had become increasingly concerned that Britain's judiciary had become a self-perpetuating oligarchy. Here was a group of similarly minded people from similar backgrounds who had a particular worldview and were resolute in protecting their own interests. Then there was the fact that we were saddled with an increasingly left-wing legal establishment that had successfully tied successive British government ups in knots through judicial reviews. In particular, challenging policies on welfare and immigration, and most recently, the entire Brexit process. Courts and laws had been accruing power during the 80s and 90s through the judicial review process, and the EU's promotion of statutory law over common law only added to the problem. But it was Blair who had made a bad state of affairs a whole lot worse. The policies he pursued as Prime Minister had made it considerably harder for elected politicians to get things done and put far more power in the hands of the unelected. Until 2005, the Lord Chancellor held a special constituency position not only as a cabinet minister but also as the head of the judicial and the Speaker of the House of Lords. There were historic duties dating back to before Magna Carta. In other words, he, and until my appointment it always had been a man, was a very powerful figure, playing a role in the executive, judicial and legislative branches of government. He sat in the House of Lords and was a practicing judge, with many of his responsibilities involving the direct administration of the judicial system and the selection of judges. Parliament is sovereign. The independent judicial mandated the common law practices of the rule of law. Ultimately, they were subordinate to the executive in Parliament. The Constituency Reform Act of 2005 changed this by denuding the Lord Chancellor of much of this power. These changes were devised by Charlie Falconer, Lord Falconer of Thornton, a one-time flatmate of Blair's. One of the justifications for this constitutional vandalism was a desire to fit in with the rights-based philosophy of continental Europe. The UK's ratifying of the European Convention on Human Rights, the ECHR, in 1951 ultimately gave rise to individual petitions being accepted in the UK. This created an alternative source of power to the sovereign parliament. Eventually, Blair incorporated the ECHR into British law in 1998 through the Human Rights Act. Under this approach, it was thought no longer right for a cabinet minister to be a judge and head of the judiciary, so Blair stripped the Lord Chancellor of these active judicial roles. But in removing the power of the executive to appoint senior judges, the Blair government did not move instead to an elected system, as exists in other countries. Rather, a new judicial appointments quango was created, as was a Supreme Court in place of the law lords. Judges were also given partial responsibility for running the court service. The Lord Chancellor would still have to swear an oath to protect the independence of the judiciary, but all the associated powers were removed and handed to the administrative bureaucracy. The net impact was to make the judiciary more of a self-appointing oligarchy and reduce levels of accountability. As we were to see in everything from welfare policy to immigration to legal aid, this made it harder for democratically elected governments to deliver policies the public had voted for. The legacy legislation from the Blair and Brown administrations that we failed to repeal, including the Human Rights Act and the Equality Act, tied up the government in red tape and gave more powers to the courts and laws. All this meant a key part of the apparatus of the government had become further removed from any sense of accountability. I looked enviously across the Atlantic, where there were elected judges and prosecutors at a constituency-appointed Supreme Court. Of course, the US system is not perfect. The activities of increasingly activist lawyers, funded by deep-pocketed left-wingers, were cause for concern. But the Supreme Court's recent rightward tilt, the result of Republicans winning elections rather than any oligarchical preference, gave me hope. I felt instinctively that major reform was needed in Britain to reserve Blair's disastrous legal takeover and return to the system that had successfully been tried and tested for virtually 1,000 years. Yet, when I was appointed Lord Chancellor and Justice Secretary, I had limited time to think grand thoughts about the Constitution. As with other reshuffles, I'd had no prior notice that I would be getting the job, and the minute I arrived at the department, it was clear there was a whole series of fires that needed to be put out. Blair had crafted the Orwellian-sounding Ministry of Justice in 2007, as was one of his final acts before leaving office and handing the reins of power to Brown. It was an awkward amalgam of ceremony and prisoner, cell block H, and contained yet more hand-to-manage quangos, dealing with everything from prisons and probation to the Child Maintenance Service. The Ministry of Justice was housed in the old Home Office headquarters overlooking St. James's Park. This 1970s concrete office block was a brutalist monstrosity. I quickly discovered that the department was in a mess and short on cash to fix the justice system, which was both overcrowded and the guardian of a dilapidated estate of buildings around the country. Back in 2010, Ken Clarke, the former Chancellor who made a surprise comeback to frontline politics as Justice Secretary, wanted to cut the budget by letting people out of prison earlier. Liberal-minded people often think it should be easy to reduce prison numbers, as though our jails are just full of shoplifters and other minor criminals. The reality is that by far the largest number of inmates, over 60%, are in prison for serious sexual or violent crimes or drug offences. Unless you are prepared to make their sentences shorter, which I was certainly not, there is not much leeway to reduce numbers. In fact, by international standards, the UK has a fairly modest rate of imprisonment, with around 159 prisoners per 100,000 people in England and Wales. This is mid-table as far as an OECD countries are concerned, and vastly lower than the United States, which has seen rates of up to 755 prisoners per 100,000 people in the last 2 decades. Whether you argue with cutting prisoner numbers or not, the fact is that it didn't happen. With Cameron rowing back on his support for Clarke's proposals, there was no reduction in the prison population in England and Wales, which passed 85,000 for the first time in June 2010 and peaked at just over 88,000 in November of 2011, a point that was reached once again in late 2023. The spending cuts went ahead regardless, however, leading to huge pressure on the prison's budget. This was obvious as soon as I arrived. With prison violence on an upward trend and the system stretched to breaking point, my predecessors had tried to paper over the cracks by talking about big ideas. There was allegedly a white paper lying out proposals on prison reform ready to go. I soon found out it didn't exist. I was horrified by the state that our prisons were in, many of which dated back to Victorian times. They were rodent-infested. It was remarkably easy to get phones, drugs, and other paraphernalia inside. Not enough work and training was taking place. There were some beacons of hope like Cafe Britannia in HMP Norwich and the Bad Boys Bakery in HMP Brixton, but they often relied on heroic individuals rather than systematic improvements. It was the frontline staff who had to deal with all this. Prison officers were some of the most impressive and least appreciated public servants I came across during my 10 years in government. They were massively underpaid, given the difficulty and dangerous job they had to do, their lives were on the line, and they were facing significant increases in violence from inmates. Many of them were on salaries of under £30,000. No wonder so many were leaving the service. Combined with the overall cut in prison officer numbers as a result of budget reductions, many prisons were dangerously understaffed, while unreformed working practices were leading to further problems. It was an appalling situation. One of the few things that did once keep me up at night was the fate of a prison officer who was left severely injured by an inmate and whose life was hanging by a thread. Mercifully, he survived. To make our prisons safe and secure, we needed to recruit more prison officers and pay them better. This would require 2,500 prison officers at a cost of some £100 million per year. We set to work on drawing up a white paper on comprehensive reform to the prison systems that included this commitment. I am an instinctive hawk on spending, but I was determined to spend more in this area and reserve the cuts that my predecessors had made. I've always believed that the state should do less, but what it does do, it should do better. Incarcerating criminals to keep the public safe is a core function of government, and pursuing cuts to the system without considering the consequences had been an example of the worst sort of short-termism. We were paying the price for that in terms of the safety of prison officers, and I had no hesitation in doing what was necessary to fix the problem. It was a moral duty. To get it done, I first had to secure the necessary additional funds. I went to see the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, David Gork, who thankfully understood at once the scale of the problem. He agreed to the increase in the prison's budget I was seeking, and we were able to finalize the white paper on that basis. I announced it at the start of November 2016. The need to take urgent action on prisons was becoming ever more apparent. Overcrowding and a shortage of staff was leading to dangerous conditions and outbreaks of violence. Days after my announcement, 200 inmates rioted at Bedford Prison, and on the same day, 2 prisoners escaped from Pentonville, where weeks earlier an inmate had been murdered. The Prison Officers Association, POA, organized protests outside prisons and encouraged a walkout by officers that amounted to an unlawful strike. This was not just against the law, it was highly dangerous. It meant staffing in prisons was stretched even further, requiring prisoners to be kept in their cells for prolonged periods, stoking resentment and the potential for more violence. After frantic phone calls that morning, we took the POA to court and officers were ordered to end the protest and return to work. The situation was still highly volatile. Frazzled prison officers, overcrowded prisons awash with drugs like spice, a type of synthetic marijuana, and rising levels of violence made for a tinderbox at constant risk of igniting. The spark came in Birmingham the following month, on Friday the 16th of December. I had just got in the car with Hugh, Francis and Liberty to drive to Norfolk for Christmas, when I took a call from the prison's minister, Sam Jimia, who told me there was a serious riot underway at HMP Birmingham, and the situation was spiralling out of control. He hadn't got much further than a few streets from home when we had to turn the car around and head back. I hurried straight into the office to get to grips with the situation. That morning, an inmate in the prison's end wing had climbed onto some safety netting between floors. When previous officers tried to intervene, one of them had his key snatched. The staff had to withdraw from their own safety, and the prisoners soon gained control of the wing. And then the neighbouring P wing, officers were looted and mattresses were set on fire. A tornado team of specialists was dispatched, but by lunchtime, prisoners had gained control of a further 2 wings. We learned later that just one padlock on a single gate separating the other wings had prevented the entire prison from being overwhelmed. As further reinforcements were summoned and police secured the perimeter, Gaimia and I spent a tense afternoon on the phone to senior prison staff and prison governors around the country. The danger was that once word spread to other prisons of what was going on at Birmingham, it would trigger a wave of similar violence across the country. We authorized extra resources to try to ward off trouble elsewhere, as officials put together a plan to retake the rioting wings. That evening, 10 tornado teams swept through and had taken back control by 10 p.m. It was the most serious prison disturbance since the Strangeways prison riot of 1990 in Manchester, which lasted 25 days and injured close to 200 people. On investigation, it seemed the trigger had been a mix of complaints about cold showers, the food, gym time being cancelled, and prisoners being locked in their cells all day because of a lack of staff. In the immediate aftermath of the riot, we made it a priority to fix some of these basic problems. I found myself on a daily phone call with prison governors, authorizing extra budget for chips and the like to keep the prisons calm. Ministers ended up having to personally direct the service and take responsibility for the problems, many of which were decades in the making. The state of prisons was the most severe problem, but it was clear that serious reform was needed across the board, from youth justice to family courts to probation. In the end, I only had 11 months in the job at the Ministry of Justice. It would take more like 11 years of serious reform to make the system functional. It is very hard to see how this will ever be achieved. There is frankly limited public and media interest. I'd announced the extra funds to recruit thousands of prison officers in a speech on the 3rd of November 2016, which had received some coverage. Yet that very evening, the Daily Mail published a story that would completely obliterate any of the achievements we'd made on prisons. The UK's High Court had earlier that day handed down judgment in a case brought by pro-EU activist Gina Miller over whether the government was required to win a vote in Parliament before it could trigger the start of Brexit negotiations. The court found the government did require parliamentary approval, a decision that provoked intense criticism from ardent Brexiteers. The following day's Daily Mail carried the front page headline, "Enemies of the People," below pictures of 3 senior judges who had given the judgment. As it happened, on the night that front page appeared, I was at a dinner at Mill Temple, one of the Inns of Court for barristers, at the heart of the British legal establishment. There seemed to be no outage or demands for me to intervene, just an acceptance with an air of resignation, that this was the Daily Mail being the Daily Mail. Some of those present later jumped on the bandwagon of criticism, but it was clear that that night they had saw it as nothing more than the Eurosceptic press having its say, albeit in a rather forceful way. The story was whipped into a scandal because of the febrile politics of Brexit. Those on the Leave side felt outraged at what they saw as the legal establishment seeking to block the democratic will of the people. The Remain side saw the headline as an outrageous attack on the independence of the judiciary, and it seemed the beginning of the end of civilization as we knew it. The calls for me to wade in and condemn the Mail grew even louder, with social media campaigns demanding I issue a statement alongside pious commentary about how I had sworn an oath to defend judges and how it was my duty to do so now. I found the outrage completely mystifying. Of course I supported and do support the independence of the judiciary and had indeed sworn an oath to uphold the rule of law, but this was a headline in the Daily Mail, not an attempted coup. I also believe passionately in the freedom of the press and in the right of people to criticise those in positions of authority. In my view, the Daily Mail was perfectly entitled to criticise judges, and judges were perfectly at liberty to ignore the newspaper. This is the essence of a free society. Judicial independence is important, but it isn't the same as being entirely immune from criticism. Those were my instincts when the row over the headline began to escalate. A narrative began to develop that I had been ordered by the Prime Minister not to say anything and that I was too weak to push back. The truth was that I needed no encouragement to stay out of the media storm. I had no interest in providing fuel to the fire when I was in the middle of trying to tackle a near crisis in the prison service, and at that point the judiciary and the Lord Chief Justice, Lord Thomas of Quimkead, one of those pictured on the Mail front page that day, weren't asking me to get involved. But the hysteria spread like wildfire. More and more lawyers and commentators demanded I say something, and of course, whatever I did say didn't satisfy them because I thought it was completely wrong for a government minister to be interfering with what the press had printed. Civil servants at the Ministry of Justice seemed more interested in appeasing a wounded judiciary than doing what was right. They were beholden to this vested interest and their own ideological leanings rather than reflecting the will of the democratically elected government. I held a staff meeting in the foyer of the Ministry of Justice building, and one official asked why I had not condemned the attacks on the judiciary. There was a large outburst of applause, leaving me in no doubt about what people's views were on what was a policy question. In retrospect, maybe I should have been more front-footed before the row escalated to absurd levels. But had I done so, it would have merely been to say that I believed fundamentally not just in the independence of the judiciary, but also in the freedom of the press, and that both must be respected. I was never going to join those who wanted the Daily Mail pilloried for daring to criticise a judicial decision. Yet again, the British media would rather have had a witch hunt over what someone had or hadn't condemned than deal with the very serious underlying issues with our democracy and the parlous state of the criminal and civil justice system. Looking back at the enemies of the people row, I should have not been surprised that it blew up with such vehemence. While it had properly exploded, appropriately enough, on Guy Fawkes' night, the issue of my relationship with the judiciary had been a slow-burning fuse that had been lit months before. It is fair to say the judicial establishment had not welcomed my appointment as Lord Chancellor in July 2016. Lord Fawkes, a lawyer who had been Justice Minister for 2 years, resigned immediately in protest. He questioned my ability to do the job and whether I would have sufficient clout to stand up to the Prime Minister. The former Lord Chancellor, Charlie Faulkner, joined the attack, writing a withering article for the Times, arguing that I had failed to meet the criteria laid down in law of being qualified by experience, and calling me an ambitious, middle-ranking cabinet minister. This was absolute chic from the man who had vandalised the Constitution and denigrated the role of Lord Chancellor by devising the Constitutional Reform Act of 2005. But it has set the tone for much of the commentary during my first days in office. All the lawyers who attacked me were keen to stress that their remarks were nothing personal, but it seemed odd that such a fierce backlash had not accomplished the appointment of my 2 immediate predecessors, Chris Grayling and Michael Gove. Neither of them had a background as a lawyer, but they seemed to have been given the benefit of the doubt. The root of the problem, I soon realised, was that the judiciary and wider legal profession are special interest groups, that they have been used to having their own people in positions of power for centuries, and don't take kindly to outsiders, particularly transient politicians. They wanted a Lord Chancellor who was from their background and comfortable in their world. Failing that, they wanted someone who would champion their interests and not challenge their fundamentals. I was clearly not this. Politicians are there to represent the public, not professional interests. Although special pleading in Commons across departments, the judiciary had become used to being a particularly special case. In part, this is because many politicians have been too scared to take on the judiciary. Senior judges can indeed be quite intimidating. They have a unique ability to make life extremely difficult for a government, should they be so minded. The legal profession is also strongly represented in Parliament and public life more generally, and they form a strong and effective lobbying network to resist any change they don't like. Advocacy is what they do, after all. I hadn't realised quite how the legal establishment works. They operate by briefing the press, particularly the Times, as well as using their many connections in the House of Lords. They tried to both charm me and shame me into going along with what they wanted. Lots of cosy breakfasts and dinners on the one hand, while not clapping loudly enough when they welcomed me on the other. As somebody who has never aspired to be part of the establishment, this didn't impress me very much. I am, after all, a contrarian. I was more interested in changing things to make them better. I view respect for the law and an acceptance of the importance of independent court judgments as cornerstones of our freedom. But the independence of the judiciary has begun to be interpreted as meaning they should be immune to any challenge to how they operate or the way they are appointed. Making independent and impartial judgments does not mean carte blanche. This was most obvious in the field of recruitment. Since the Blair vandalism of 2005, the judiciary had become a self-appointed oligarchy, choosing and promoting those who shared their values. I was particularly concerned by the lack of meritocracy in the selection of judges. The system of promotions was biased entirely towards barristers and against solicitors, who tend to spend their time helping clients navigate the legal system rather than in the courtroom. The first step in the process of being appointed as a judge is a requirement to first sit part-time for a year, which is far easier to do if you are a barrister and more difficult if you are a high-flying solicitor with a global firm. I wanted to make it easier for solicitors to progress up the ranks by merit, but this was hugely resisted by snobby senior barristers. Likewise, good women seemed to have been overlooked because they didn't fit the profile. It struck me at the time as a cozy old boys' club, and they considered it a gross impertinence that I shouldn't even be questioning them on such matters. Things came to a head over the process for the recruitment of the next Lord Chief Justice, with Lord Thomas due to retire in the autumn of 2017. It seemed clear to me that a classic establishment stitch-up was in progress to appoint a particular candidate favoured by the incumbent and other senior judges, and then Chief of the Criminal Court, Brian Leveson. The problem, however, was that he was approaching the mandatory retirement age, then 70, and would only be able to serve for about 18 months. With so much going on, not least with regard to Brexit, I thought we needed a bit more stability in the judiciary. Given that US Supreme Court justices reserve lifetime appointments, surely the UK could offer a bit more tenure without upsetting the apple cart too much. I therefore exercised what limited influence I had over the process to insist that candidates must be able to serve for at least 4 years. This is what Lord Thomas would have served by the time of his retirement, and has in fact been the average term served by each Lord Chief Justice over the last 30 years. Had we ended up with an appropriate serving less than 2 years, it would have been the shortest tenure in the role since 1921, with an exceptional decision was taken to make a temporary appointment, which was hugely controversial at the time. Despite my request being entirely reasonable in terms of the expected tenure of the appointment, it sparked another huge backlash from the judicial powers that be. The idea that I, a non-lawyer politician, should have a role in the appointment process was painted as an outrageous attack on judicial independence, and the press were briefed accordingly. The fact that was, prior to 2005, such appointments were routinely made by the Lord Chancellor, who sat in the cabinet, was conveniently ignored. Under the current system, I had no role in the actual choice, which was entirely run by the Judicial Appointments Commission. They conducted the interviews and made a recommendation of a single name. Rejecting that name was technically possible, but I was left in no doubt that doing so would have been seen as a tantamount to declaring war. In any event, the backlash came in the form of a quite extraordinary diatribe from the outgoing Lord Chief Justice, Lord Thomas. Giving evidence to a House of Commons committee in March 2017, he belatedly attacked me over the enemies of the people saga, saying I was utterly wrong not to have condemned the Daily Mail. Having publicly expressed no concerns whatsoever at the time, it seemed he only chose to turn his fire on me when I blocked his plan to handpick his successor. By this time, I was also getting some resistance to changes I wanted to make to the court's administration, and Lord Thomas also took a swipe at some of those in his remarks. One of the most prominent changes I was advocating was to extend the use of video evidence by women in rape cases. This seemed to me an obviously humane way of reducing the psychological impact of those victims who would otherwise have to appear in front of their alleged attackers. I had a lot of support on that from victims' organisations and even Labour MPs, but the judicial establishment had been airily dismissive. I'd had to have severe arguments with them even to get a pilot programme up and running. Yet again, the judiciary had been allowed to exempt themselves from political accountability and scrutiny. It is all very well to respect the independence of learned judges to interpret and apply the law, But why should they also be left to run the whole administration of the justice system? As a result, we have a situation where judges are in charge of everything from the upkeep of court buildings to the daily listing of cases, deciding where and when cases are heard and how many court sitting days there will be per year. Administrative matters that have a huge impact on people going through the legal system are also left to them to oversee, and they resist any attempt from ministers to rationalize and improve the system. There doesn't seem to be any huge constituency principle at stake in ensuring that the delivery of a vital public service that costs millions of pounds of taxpayers' money is subject to proper accountability and direction from politically accountable ministers. We see this most clearly in the case of illegal immigration. Time and time again, attempts to get tough on migration have been thwarted when lawyers have been able to take on immigrants' cases, paid for through taxpayer-funded legal aid, usually after citing some article or other from the ECHR. I am all for the UK's asserting its sovereignty and leaving the convention, but I don't believe that alone will solve the problem. We were not able to fully sort out our borders and illegal immigration until we have reformed the appointments and governance process of the British judiciary. My 11 months as Justice Secretary were an eye-opener. Although I, no doubt, went about it in a clumsy fashion, I tried to deliver what I thought most people in Britain would want from the justice system, fixing the very serious problem of violence in prisons, making life better for victims, and trying to introduce more meritocracy into the judicial system. The sheer level of snobbery, the power of vested interest, and the disdain for the democratically decided will of the British people, whether it was over Brexit or immigration policy, shocked me. The public sector quangos put in charge after 2005 had allowed the illegal establishment to run the whole system themselves. This is part of a wider culture of increased technocracy, with politicians lacking the self-confidence to assert the democratic right to exercise responsibility and take decisions on behalf of the public. From the Bank of England and the Office for Budget Responsibility, the OBR, to the Judicial Appointments Commission, the message is that politicians are not to be trusted and we should leave things to independent experts. The truth is that none of these bodies is truly independent. Too often, that word has come to mean merely a lack of accountability to the public. This becomes a serious problem when, as inevitable, the vested interests begin to develop a worldview and set on priorities that is out of step with the wishes of the people. In order to change Britain and deal with these long-standing issues, political accountability must be restored to the justice system. In the US, there is a much more democratic debate over the appointment of judges and political input into the process. At the federal level, the President nominates Supreme Court justices and other federal judges who are then subject to confirmation by the Senate. At the Senate level, or the state level, a similar process exists whereby governors nominate some candidates while others are directly elected. It is vital that we restore democratic accountability to the judicial system in the UK. This means a return to a system that has its heart the notion of parliamentary sovereignty, which has always been at the core of British constitution. The attempts to install a European-style separation of powers have been a failure and crafted dysfunction and mission creep. This restoration will require a wholesale reversal of all the damaging changes introduced during the new Labour years. This means the abolishment of the Supreme Court, dismantling the Judicial Appointments Commission, and restoring the Law Lords. The Lord Chancellor's full role should be reinstated, including being head of the judiciary in England and Wales. These constitutional arrangements were tried, tested, and successful for centuries. Hopefully in time, the experience of the last couple of decades, following Blair's trashing of our previous judicial system, will come to be seen as no more than a temporary aberration.